The hearing was expected to be swift, a formality buried in the usual monotony of court proceedings. Tom Homan entered the federal courthouse with a quiet confidence, but behind his composed demeanor was a storm ready to be unleashed. Judge James Boasberg presided at the bench, his presence a calculated blend of authority and aloofness, his reputation shielding him from suspicion for years. The courtroom was filled with lawyers, clerks, and media representatives, none of whom anticipated the explosive confrontation that was about to unfold. What was scheduled to be a hearing on immigration enforcement quickly swerved into dangerous territory. Homan, invited to provide his insights as a policy expert, wasted no time before taking aim at something far more sinister than legal procedures. With a voice that commanded attention, he shifted the focus toward the judge himself. Whispers rose among those present as Homan spoke not of enforcement strategies, but of compromised rulings, untraceable donations, and suspicious connections tying Boasberg to powerful benefactors whose names rarely saw the light of public scrutiny. Judge Boasberg bristled immediately. His practiced calm began to crack, revealing a simmering rage just beneath the surface. Homan's accusations weren't vague insinuations. They were specific, piercing, and presented in a sequence that drew a straight line from the judge's gavel to private interests that benefited from his decisions. The room, once static, was now electric with tension. Court officers exchanged nervous glances while reporters fumbled for their phones, instinctively sensing history in the making. Homan dug deeper, pulling out records and statements that suggested rulings favoring major donors had become routine in Boasberg's court. The allegations cut at the heart of judicial impartiality, and for a judge long perceived as unshakable, Boasberg was now visibly rattled. His responses became clipped, defensive, and increasingly hostile. He barked orders in an attempt to regain control, but the room was no longer bending to his authority. It was leaning in toward Homan. What made the exchange all the more charged was the way both men refused to back down. Homan's tone sharpened with every piece of damning information he laid bare, while Boasberg retaliated with barely veiled threats and a mounting fury that betrayed his fear of being exposed. Every word spoken between them was a hammer blow to the illusion of judicial sanctity. The room seemed to shrink with intensity, and at the peak of the confrontation, something unprecedented happened. The heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and in stepped a line of federal investigators. Not court officers, not local police, but federal agents, clear, deliberate, and silent in their movements. Their arrival shifted the room's energy from tense to volatile. It was no longer a courtroom. It was a powder keg. Every pair of eyes turned toward the agents. Boasberg's face, already pale with frustration, now drained of color. Homan, unfazed, stood his ground, as if their presence was expected. As the agents conferred discreetly with the marshals, murmurs swept through the gallery. The federal government was no longer watching from a distance. It had entered the room. The judge tried to continue the hearing, but his voice faltered, then failed completely. He realized, perhaps for the first time in his career, that his authority was not absolute. Homan had pierced through it like a spear, and now federal eyes were watching his every move, and that was only the beginning. The courtroom had fallen into an eerie silence. For a moment, no one dared to speak. The arrival of the federal agents had turned the confrontation between Tom Homan and Judge Boasberg into something far larger than anyone in the room had expected. Boasberg's face remained frozen in disbelief, his mouth slightly open, but no words came out. He glanced toward his clerks, toward the bailiffs, as if expecting someone, anyone, to intervene. But the tide had already turned. The federal agents took position near the benches, speaking quietly into radios and surveying the scene. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that builds not before chaos, but justice. Boasberg, though visibly shaken, attempted to reassert his grip on the proceedings. His voice returned, louder and harsher than before, barking out commands and claiming Homan's accusations were fabrications, politically motivated attacks without evidence. But his anger betrayed his desperation. He no longer sounded like a judge defending his court. He sounded like a man cornered. Homan, standing firm, wasn't done. With cold precision, he began unveiling a series of documented rulings that had disproportionately favored companies linked to Boasberg's longtime acquaintances and campaign donors. Each ruling on its own could be dismissed as coincidence, but Homan had connected the pattern. Cases were being steered. Conflicts of interest were buried under bureaucratic language. Millions of dollars flowed between hands behind closed doors, and at the center of it all stood Boasberg, once untouchable, now exposed. The media in the courtroom, once passive observers, became frantic scribes. Cameras began rolling despite courtroom restrictions. The spectacle unfolding was too monumental to ignore. Every glance, every word between Homan and Boasberg had the weight of a nation's trust in its legal system hanging in the balance. Boasberg rose from his seat in defiance, slamming papers onto his desk, his voice cracking with outrage. But the veneer of judicial dominance had shattered. No matter how much he shouted, the courtroom no longer belonged to him. It had become a forum of reckoning. Homan's unwavering demeanor only made it worse. He refused to engage in petty exchanges, letting the evidence speak for itself. Each document revealing another layer of corruption. And then came the turning point. One of the federal agents approached the bench and handed Boasberg a sealed envelope. The courtroom collectively held its breath as the judge tore it open. His expression shifted from fury to disbelief, then to fear. The envelope contained a formal notice, a notification of a federal inquiry into his conduct, and a directive to surrender specific case records for immediate review. Gasps echoed through the room. Boasberg was no longer presiding as a judge. He was now a subject of investigation, standing in the very seat from which he had once delivered judgments with unchecked authority. It was a reversal so stark, so stunning, that even seasoned lawyers present found themselves shaken. Homan pressed forward. He turned the conversation toward the people who had suffered under Boasberg's rulings. Small business owners crushed by legal games, whistleblowers silenced by procedural delays, immigrants denied fair hearings, and ordinary citizens whose faith in the system had been quietly eroded. Homan's voice wasn't just factual anymore. It was emotional, enraged, personal. He wasn't fighting for political points. He was fighting for the soul of justice itself. Boasberg could barely respond. His usual legal shields, so carefully cultivated over the years, were failing him. His voice trembled as he tried to issue a recess, but the court reporter ignored him. The agents were now reviewing files with quiet urgency, ignoring the judge's attempts to maintain order. Everything was moving too fast. Boasberg was no longer in control. The moment that broke him came when one of the agents asked to confiscate his laptop and case notes. The request was delivered calmly, but its implication thundered louder than any gavel strike. Boasberg refused. The refusal turned into a standoff. Homan stood motionless, watching the judge crumble under the weight of his own deception. And just when it seemed things couldn't escalate further, one of the agents stepped toward the podium, raised a document, and announced an immediate review of Boasberg's ruling history. Not tomorrow, not next week. Now! The courtroom gasped again, but Homan didn't flinch. This was what he had prepared for. The walls of corruption were cracking. The empire of secrets that had protected the judge was no longer impenetrable, and justice, long delayed, was finally beginning to move. The courtroom no longer resembled a place of order. What had begun as a formal hearing had spiraled into an arena of unraveling power, where the authority once seated at the bench now trembled beneath a storm of revelations. Judge Boasberg's composure had dissolved, replaced by scattered frustration, red-faced defiance, and visible desperation. He shuffled through papers with shaking hands attempting to reclaim some semblance of control, but every motion only made him look more frantic, more exposed. Tom Homan stood silently, arms crossed, letting the weight of the moment speak louder than any words. His work was already done. He had cracked open the dam, and now the flood was coming. The agents moved with calculated intent, securing files, whispering into their earpieces, and casting glances toward the judge that held no deference, only suspicion. Outside the courtroom, the world had caught wind of the spectacle. Protesters gathered on the courthouse steps, some demanding accountability, others demanding resignations. The story had spread like wildfire. News vans lined the block, drones hovered overhead, and social media fed on every leaked clip and whispered account of what was happening inside. Boasberg's name, once whispered in elite legal circles with reverence, was now trending for all the wrong reasons. Inside, the confrontation grew darker. Boasberg lashed out at the federal agents, questioning their authority, demanding warrants, insisting on procedural delays. But every outburst chipped away at his credibility. The man who once spoke in measured tones and ruled from a place of impenetrable legal knowledge now looked like a panicked defendant grasping at straws. Homan didn't speak unless necessary. When he did, his words cut with precision. He described past cases, one by one, where litigants had no idea the odds had been stacked against them from the start. He highlighted the families who lost everything to decisions made in secret meetings, and the organizations blacklisted because they refused to play into the judge's network of influence. At one point, a court officer tried to remove a reporter who had taken out a phone. Boasberg, in a sudden burst of arrogance, ordered the officer to clear the entire gallery. But the agents intervened. One of them, without raising his voice, informed the judge that no such order would be followed under the circumstances. The message was clear. This was no longer his courtroom. Boasberg looked around and saw it. No eyes of respect, no signs of allegiance. The bailiffs avoided his gaze. The clerks typed without acknowledgement. His authority had become hollow, and the echoes of his gavel no longer carried weight. Then came the most damning blow. One of the agents stepped forward and placed a small stack of documents on the podium. Financial records, unsealed and verified. They painted a picture not just of bias, but of outright bribery. Payments routed through shell companies. Donations laundered through nonprofit fronts. Boasberg's signature attached to transactions he had long denied. The paper trail was undeniable, and for the first time in his life, the judge had no words. Homan didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply nodded once, a silent gesture of acknowledgement that the truth had finally found its way into the light. Boasberg attempted to stand, to leave, to escape the growing sense that everything was crumbling around him. But he was stopped, not by force, but by the weight of every eye in that room. The silence that followed was louder than any accusation. It was the silence of reckoning. And in that moment, the courtroom transformed into something far greater than a place for hearings. It became a monument to accountability, built not on marble, but on defiance, on truth, on the courage of a man who refused to let corruption live in the shadows. Outside, the chants grew louder. People were no longer watching from a distance. They were demanding action. Inside, the agents prepared the next phase, and Tom Homan stood, still, waiting for the final moment when justice would no longer be a concept, but a consequence. The final moments in that courtroom played out with a weight that could be felt in the very air. Judge Boasberg, once cloaked in prestige and entitlement, stood surrounded not by deference, but by scrutiny. His defiance had faded to silence, and in its place came the cold realization that the system he had quietly manipulated was no longer his to control. The lead agent stepped forward once more, this time with a command that left no room for resistance. Boasberg was informed he would be escorted from the premises, pending a full investigation and immediate cooperation with federal authorities. No courtroom drama, no chance to deliver one last speech. Just a quiet end to the illusion he had held for so long. His expression twisted, not from fear, but from disbelief. It was clear that, in his mind, this moment should have been impossible. But it wasn't. The evidence was overwhelming. The walls that once protected him had collapsed in full view of the public, and now the nation watched as a judge was removed from his own bench under suspicion of deep corruption. A hush spread as he was led away, each step marking the fall of a figure who had abused the very institution he was sworn to uphold. Tom Homan didn't watch him go with satisfaction. This wasn't a victory for ego. It was a correction, of course. A necessary, brutal act of truth in a world too often softened by compromise. As the agents filed out behind Boasberg, carrying files and digital records that would feed into a much larger inquiry, Homan turned and walked toward the gallery, passing by rows of stunned faces. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions, but he ignored them. His job wasn't finished. The courtroom, now stripped of its corrupted figurehead, had become a symbol of what could happen when ordinary people stood up against power misused. The story was no longer about one man. It was about what came next. Outside, the streets roared. Crowds had gathered from every direction, some holding signs demanding further investigation, others cheering the removal of a man many had feared could never be touched. The footage of the hearing, now circulating across every platform, had ignited something larger than outrage. It had reignited belief. Belief that justice could still be served, even to those who once seemed immune to it. Later that evening, statements from federal officials confirmed what many had suspected. A formal probe had been launched not only into Boasberg's rulings, but also into a broader ring of influence that extended into other corners of the judicial system. Other names were being looked into. Other files were being pulled. The exposure of one had opened the door to many. Homan, in a private setting hours later, sat quietly with a folder of cases he had long suspected were tainted. These weren't just statistics or files to him. They were people, individuals and families whose lives had been altered by rulings born from personal gain. And now, finally, someone had listened. Not because it was easy, but because it was right. The triumph didn't come with applause or parades. It came with silence, a silence that followed the fall of corruption and the slow, steady rebuilding of trust. By the next morning, Judge Boasberg's name had been removed from the court's official listings. His chambers were sealed, his decisions placed under review, and his legacy, once crafted in stone, now lay scattered like dust. Tom Homan didn't celebrate. He simply moved forward, because this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of accountability. And for the first time in a long while, the people watching from outside the courtroom believed again, not in the people who wore robes, but in the idea that no one is above the law.